If your last name is Scottish, I need you to stop scrolling for the next 10 minutes. Because what I'm about to tell you isn't folklore, it isn't a guess, and it isn't something you'll find on a tourist tartan chart. It's what your Y chromosome has been quietly recording for over 1,000 years, before there were passports, before there were birth certificates, before any government anywhere kept a ledger of who belonged to whom. A Scottish family had exactly one form of identification, and that was a name. Not a first name, a surname. In the Highlands and the Lowlands alike, that second name was the closest thing a person had to a badge, a passport, and a bloodline all folded into one word. It told strangers who your father was, who his father was, and which glen, which loch, which stretch of contested land your people had bled for. And here is the part almost nobody explains properly. That name was never just a label. It was a signal, encoded generation after generation. And it turns out that signal is still readable today, sitting quietly inside your own cells. We have spent centuries treating clan identity like something you inherit from a book. You find your surname on a laminated chart in a gift shop, you get handed a tartan, you buy a scarf, and that's supposed to be the end of it. But that is not how clans actually worked. And it is definitely not how Ancestry actually works. Clans were not brand names. They were living networks of kinship, obligation, and shared land, built across centuries of war, marriage, famine, and migration. And because paperwork in Scotland before the 18th century was patchy at best, and because the Highland clearances later scattered entire communities across oceans, a huge percentage of Scottish descendants today have no paper trail that goes back far enough to prove anything. Their written records simply stop. The parish registers burn, the ship's manifests get lost, the family Bible goes missing in a move nobody remembers. For most people, the story ends in silence somewhere around the early 1700s. Except it doesn't have to end there anymore, because while the paper trail was disappearing, something else was being written the entire time, in a place no fire could reach and no flood could destroy. Your DNA. Think for a moment about just how much was actually lost. The Highland clearances, stretching roughly from the mid-1700s into the mid-1800s, saw entire communities forcibly removed from land. Their families had worked for generations, land cleared to make way for sheep grazing and profit. Villages were burned, families were loaded onto ships bound for Canada, the United States, Australia, and New Zealand, often with almost nothing beyond the clothes they were wearing. Along the way, records were separated from the people they described. A family that once had a clear documented line back through the parish registers of a specific glen might arrive on a new continent with nothing but a surname, a rough sense of where they'd come from, and whatever story survived the crossing. Multiply that single family story by hundreds of thousands of people, spread across 2 centuries, and you start to understand why so many Scottish descendants today hit a wall in their research that simply cannot be crossed using paper alone. Here's the part that surprises almost everyone the first time they hear it. Most commercial DNA tests, the ones you've probably seen advertised, the ones that spit out a colorful pie chart telling you that you're 40% Scottish and 20% Scandinavian, are not actually the tool that connects you to a specific clan. Those tests look at your entire genome, mixed together from every ancestor you've ever had, on every branch of your family tree. That's useful for a broad picture, but it's far too blended to trace one specific bloodline all the way back to a specific glen. To do that, you need something much more precise. You need Y-DNA. Y-DNA is the genetic material passed down almost unchanged from father to son, generation after generation, for thousands of years. Women don't carry it because it travels along the same line that historically carried the surname itself. Think about how patronymic naming worked in Scotland. A son took his father's name, or a name built from his father's name, and that surname then moved forward through every subsequent generation of sons. Y-DNA moves along exactly the same path, which means, remarkably, that your surname and your Y chromosome have been traveling together, side by side, down the same family line, for as long as your family has existed. When researchers test the Y chromosome of men sharing a surname, they are effectively reading the same historical record that the name itself was trying to preserve, except this record can't be forged, misspelled, or lost in a house fire. Same clan name, confirming centuries of oral tradition in a single lab result. But other times, they found something stranger. They found that men carrying the exact same surname belonged to completely different unrelated paternal lines. Multiple founding fathers, multiple unrelated bloodlines, all wearing the same name like a shared coat that had been handed down through very different families entirely. And once you understand how clans actually functioned, that stops being confusing and starts making perfect sense. A Scottish clan was never a single bloodline in the strict biological sense. It was a political and territorial alliance, as much as a family. Smaller families living on a chief's land would often take the chief's surname for protection, for belonging, for safety in numbers during centuries when an unaffiliated family was a vulnerable family. These absorbed families are called septs, and they explain why two men today can share a famous clan surname and yet carry completely different genetic lineages underneath it. One might descend directly from the original chiefly bloodline. The other might descend from a family that adopted the name generations later purely for protection and alliance. Both are legitimately part of the clan story, but only DNA can tell you which branch you're actually standing on. This also explains something that trips up almost everyone who starts this kind of research with the wrong expectations. People assume that if their surname matches a clan, they must automatically be entitled to that clan's tartan, that clan's crest, that clan's entire documented history, as if the name alone were a guarantee. In reality, tartan and surname association developed largely in the 18th and 19th centuries, well after most of these genetic lines had already branched and scattered, which means the tartan chart you find in a gift shop is a cultural tradition, not a genetic certificate. That doesn't make it meaningless. Clan identity was always as much about shared loyalty, shared land, and shared history as it was about strict bloodline, and choosing to honor a name your family carried for centuries is entirely valid regardless of which specific genetic branch you turn out to belong to. But if you want to know the actual biological story behind that name, rather than the cultural one, DNA is the only record detailed enough to tell you. So let's talk about the surnames themselves, because this is where the research gets specific, and where you should start listening even more carefully if any of these names sound familiar around your own dinner table. MacDonald is one of the largest and most studied clan surnames in Scotland, tracing back to Donald, grandson of the legendary Somerled, the 12th century warlord whose descendants would go on to rule the Hebrides for centuries as the Lords of the Isles. Because the MacDonald name spread across so many branches, so many islands, and so many centuries of expansion, Y-DNA testing has revealed multiple distinct genetic clusters underneath the single surname, some tracing convincingly back toward Somerled's documented line, others representing entirely separate families who took the name later. If your surname is MacDonald, or one of its many variants, a Y-DNA test can tell you which cluster you actually belong to, rather than leaving you to assume. And because the MacDonald diaspora was so enormous, spreading from the Hebrides into Ireland, and later into North America in huge numbers, surname project databases for this name are among the largest and most active in existence, giving newly tested descendants an unusually good chance of finding a genuine genetic match. Campbell carries a similarly layered story. As one of the most powerful and politically dominant clans in Scottish history, centered around Argyll and Loch Awe, the Campbell name expanded enormously through alliance, land grants, and absorbed septs over hundreds of years. Genetic testing among Campbell descendants has shown a dominant core lineage associated with the traditional chiefly line, alongside several smaller, genetically distinct branches. A direct reflection of just how much territory and how many smaller families were folded into Clan Campbell's orbit over the centuries. Stewart deserves its own moment here, because it is tied directly to the Scottish royal line itself. The House of Stewart, or Stewart, produced kings and queens of Scotland, and eventually of England as well. Researchers, including academic teams working specifically on documented royal descent, have used Y-DNA testing to examine whether modern Stewart descendants share genetic markers with confirmed historical figures from the royal Stewart line. The findings have been genuinely revealing, in some cases supporting long-held genealogical claims, and in other cases quietly overturning family stories that had been repeated for generations without ever being verified. Bruce is another name inseparable from Scottish history, forever linked to Robert the Bruce, the king who secured Scotland's independence at Bannockburn in 1314. Dedicated genetic research projects have focused specifically on identifying descendants of Bruce and comparing their Y-DNA markers, aiming to build a verified genetic benchmark for the line. Because the Y chromosome only passes from father to son, this kind of research depends entirely on finding living male descendants willing to test, which makes every confirmed result genuinely valuable to the wider historical record. Fraser, associated with the northeast of Scotland and later famously with the Highlands around Inverness, has a large and active surname DNA project, with hundreds of tested participants revealing several genetically distinct Fraser lineages. Some of these cluster tightly around what researchers believe to be the original founding line, while others appear to be entirely separate families who adopted the Fraser name through sept association, marriage alliances, or simple geographic convenience over the centuries. MacDougall traces back to Dougal, son of the same Somerled who founded the MacDonald line, making Clan MacDougall a genetic cousin, in a sense, to the MacDonalds, despite centuries of political rivalry between the two families. Ongoing academic research has identified the genetic markers associated with the documented MacDougall founder, alongside roughly 20 other distinct MacDougall lineages that share the surname without sharing that specific paternal ancestry. A clear demonstration of just how many separate families can end up under one historic name. Gordon, centered historically around Aberdeenshire in the northeast, shows a genetic pattern common to many powerful landowning clans, a core lineage tied to the documented chiefly family, surrounded by a wider cloud of related but distinct paternal lines, representing tenants, allies, and absorbed smaller families who took the Gordon name as the clan's territory and influence expanded across the region over hundreds of years. Sutherland, taking its name directly from the earldom of Sutherland in the far north of Scotland, offers a particularly interesting genetic case, because the region's remoteness meant fewer waves of outside migration for long stretches of history, allowing researchers to trace certain Y-DNA signatures with somewhat greater confidence back toward the earldom's documented medieval origins, though, as with every clan name, multiple lineages still exist beneath the surface. Wallace, forever associated with William Wallace and the Scottish Wars of Independence, is a name whose true genetic origins have proven surprisingly difficult to pin down with certainty, largely because records from Wallace's own era are so sparse. Modern testing among Wallace descendants has revealed a wide genetic spread rather than one dominant line, a reminder that fame in the history books does not always translate into a single traceable bloodline in the genetic record. Murray, one of the most widespread Scottish surnames, deriving from the old province of Moray, shows exactly the kind of genetic diversity you'd expect from a name that spread so far and so wide across so many centuries. Testing has identified numerous distinct Murray lineages, some connected to the historic Earls of Moray, others entirely unrelated, having adopted the name independently in different regions of Scotland at different points in history. Forbes, associated with Aberdeenshire and one of the oldest documented clans in Scotland, maintains an active clan society that has specifically supported Y-DNA and mitochondrial DNA research among its members, using genetic genealogy alongside traditional documentary records to help verify and, in some cases, correct long-standing assumptions about family connections within the wider Forbes clan network. Seaton, an old and historically significant lowland family, has been the subject of a focused genealogical and genetic project connected to the Declaration of Arbroath, Scotland's famous 1320 Declaration of Independence, with researchers working to confirm documented lines of descent through updated testing, including advanced sequencing that continues to refine what we know about the family's confirmed paternal ancestry. Ramsay and Monteith round out this list as two smaller but historically rich family names, each currently the subject of ongoing academic testing projects, including work involving documented descendants living as far away as New Zealand and Australia. A powerful reminder that Scottish genetic lines didn't stay confined to Scotland. They traveled with immigration, with the clearances, with famine, and with opportunity, scattering across the entire English-speaking world while quietly carrying their original genetic signatures along with them the whole way. 13 names, 13 very different stories, and yet every single one of them shares the same underlying truth. A surname is not proof. It's a starting point. It's a thread someone handed you without an explanation attached, and it has been sitting there, waiting for someone curious enough to actually pull on it and see how far back it leads. Some of these families will trace cleanly back to a single documented founder, standing shoulder to shoulder in the genetic record with a name history has never forgotten. Others will reveal a messier, more human story of smaller families borrowing a powerful name for protection, of unrelated lines converging under one banner out of necessity rather than blood. Neither outcome makes the name any less yours, and neither one should feel like a loss. It simply means you finally know the real shape of the story you inherited, instead of the simplified version that got passed down at the dinner table for generations. Now, here's something important that most of the flashy DNA marketing conveniently leaves out. The paternal line is only half the story. Y-DNA can only be tested in men, because only men carry it, passed from father to son in an unbroken chain. But there is a second genetic thread running through every single person, male or female, and that is mitochondrial DNA, passed down exclusively through the maternal line, from mother to child, generation after generation. While mitochondrial DNA isn't typically used to trace clan surnames, since surnames themselves follow the paternal line historically, it is enormously valuable for tracing your maternal ancestry, especially in cases where the historical record on the mother's side has been lost entirely, which, if you think about how history has traditionally been recorded, is tragically common. If you're a woman researching your Scottish heritage, or a man wanting to trace his mother's line specifically, mitochondrial testing is the tool that opens that door. It's a slower moving marker than Y-DNA, mutating far less frequently over time, which means it's better suited to confirming very deep, very old maternal connections than it is to pinpointing a specific surname or a specific century. But paired with historical research on your mother's side, birth records, marriage records, whatever fragments survive, it can still confirm or rule out a suspected maternal line with real confidence, filling in a part of the family story that the surname system was never designed to preserve in the first place. So how does this actually work in practice if you wanted to start today? The process usually begins the same way real genealogical research always has, by gathering everything you can about your known ancestors. Names, birth and death dates, locations, occupations, any family stories that have been passed down, even ones that sound exaggerated or unreliable. Family lore is often dismissed too quickly, but it frequently contains a kernel of real information buried inside the exaggeration, a place name, a rough time frame, a hint about which side of a historical conflict your ancestor stood on. From there, most people work backward through documented records as far as they can go, using parish registers, census data, and emigration records, until they hit the point where the paper trail runs out. And for most Scottish families with roots going back more than a couple of centuries, it will run out eventually. Before we go further, it's worth actually explaining what a haplogroup is, because you'll see this word constantly once you start looking into your own results, and understanding it changes how you read everything that follows. A haplogroup is essentially a very old genetic branch, defined by a specific mutation that appeared in one man thousands of years ago, and was then passed down to every single one of his male descendants from that point forward. Think of it like the trunk of an enormous tree that split at some point in deep prehistory, long before surnames, long before clans, long before Scotland even existed as a concept. Every man alive today belongs to one of these ancient branches. Within that broad branch, more recent mutations create smaller and smaller sub-branches, each one representing a more specific, more recent shared ancestor. Surname research lives on these smaller, more recent branches, the ones that formed close enough in time to actually overlap with when surnames themselves came into use roughly 1,000 years ago in Scotland. When two men with the same surname also share one of these smaller, more recent branches, that overlap is what tells researchers they very likely share a genuine common ancestor, not just a coincidentally similar name. That's the exact point where DNA testing becomes genuinely powerful rather than just a novelty. If you're male, a Y-DNA test can be compared against dedicated surname project databases, many of which are free to join and are run by genealogical organizations specifically built around collecting and organizing results by surname and clan. These projects group participants by haplogroup, the broad genetic family your paternal line belongs to, and then by more specific genetic clusters within that haplogroup, essentially reconstructing a family tree using genetic markers instead of paper documents. When your results are compared against thousands of other tested men, you may discover you match closely with a specific documented lineage, sometimes even one connected to a historically significant figure. And sometimes you may discover you belong to an entirely separate branch that adopted your surname independently, which is its own valuable piece of the puzzle rather than a disappointment. It's worth being honest about something else too, because responsible research means acknowledging the limitations alongside the exciting parts. DNA testing does not, on its own, hand you a fully documented family tree stretching back to a specific medieval chief with certainty. What it does is narrow the possibilities dramatically, connect you with genetic relatives you never knew existed, and either support or challenge the documentary evidence you already have. The strongest conclusions come from combining both approaches together, genetic results cross-referenced against actual historical records, rather than relying on either one alone. A DNA match tells you two people share a common ancestor at some point. Genealogical records help you figure out roughly when, and sometimes even who that ancestor actually was. Treat the genetic result as a lead worth chasing rather than a verdict handed down from on high, and you'll get far more out of this process than anyone chasing a quick, tidy answer ever does. There's also a practical matter worth addressing directly before you consider testing, and it's one that genealogical advisors bring up specifically because so few people think about it in advance. Submitting your DNA to a commercial testing company means sharing deeply personal biological information with a private organization, and different companies have very different policies about how that data is stored, used, and potentially shared or sold. Before you test with any provider, it's worth actually reading their privacy policy in full, understanding exactly what happens to your genetic data after your results come back, whether it's used for other research purposes, and what your options are if you ever want it deleted. This isn't meant to scare you away from testing. It's meant to make sure you go in with your eyes open, the same way you would with any decision involving something as personal as your own genetic information. It's also worth asking, before you send off a sample, exactly which relatives your results might inadvertently reveal information about. A Y-DNA test doesn't just describe you. It describes your father, your brothers, your sons, and every male relative who shares that same unbroken paternal line, whether or not they personally chose to take part. Most people are perfectly comfortable with that once they think it through, but it's the kind of thing worth mentioning to the wider family before you go digging, especially if there's any chance the results could surface a connection nobody in the family was expecting to find. If all of this has you thinking about your own surname, here's where to actually start. Major testing companies that focus specifically on genealogical Y-DNA, rather than the broader consumer ancestry tests, tend to offer the most useful results for this kind of clan research because they test the specific markers needed for surname project comparison, rather than just giving you a broad ethnicity percentage. Once you have results, dedicated Scottish surname and clan DNA projects, many of them free to join, will let you compare your genetic markers against other tested descendants who share your name. And some academic institutions run their own focused research projects on specific historically significant clans, actively looking for documented descendants willing to contribute to ongoing research. Reaching out to one of these projects doesn't just benefit you personally, it contributes to a growing body of genetic evidence that continues to refine and sometimes rewrite what historians thought they knew about how these clans actually formed, expanded, and scattered across the centuries. What makes all of this genuinely moving beyond the science itself is what it represents. For centuries, Scottish families were broken apart by conflict, by forced clearance from their own land, by famine, and by the simple economic necessity of emigration to find a better life elsewhere. Brothers ended up on different continents. Cousins lost contact for generations. Entire branches of families believed their connection to a specific glen or a specific clan had been permanently severed, existing only as a fading story told at family gatherings, less certain with every retelling. DNA testing is quietly stitching some of those broken threads back together, connecting a descendant in Nova Scotia with a documented family history in Argyll, or a family in Australia with genetic cousins still living within sight of the very hills their ancestors were forced to leave 200 years ago. Your surname was never just a word. It was, and still is, a message, encoded and passed forward by every generation that came before you, through war and peace, through famine and prosperity, through forced exile and eventual return. For a long time, the only way to read that message was to hope the paper trail survived long enough to tell the story. Now, for the first time in history, that message can be read directly from your own biology, cross-checked against thousands of other descendants carrying pieces of the same story, and placed, with real evidence behind it, back onto the map of Scotland where it actually began. Imagine, for a second, what that actually means for the family that lost everything during the clearances. The ones put on a ship at Ullapool or Fort William with no idea they would never see that coastline again. Somewhere, generations later, a descendant in Ontario or Otago or North Carolina takes a simple test, spits into a tube, and mails it off without expecting much. Weeks later, they open an email and find a list of genetic matches, and among them is a name still living in the same parish their family was, forced out of 200 years earlier. That is not a hypothetical, and it isn't rare either. That is happening right now, quietly, thousands of times a year, all over the world, as more and more descendants of the Scottish diaspora finally test and populate these surname databases. Every new participant makes the picture a little clearer for everyone else carrying that name, which is exactly why these projects keep growing and why the conclusions researchers can draw keep getting sharper with every passing year. So if your surname is one of the names we've talked about today, or even if it's a name we haven't specifically covered, the door to finding out exactly where your family truly comes from and which clan your bloodline is genuinely connected to is open right now in a way it has never been open before. Start with what you already have. Talk to the oldest relatives in your family while you still can, and write down every name, every place, every fragment of a story, even the ones that sound unreliable. Then take those fragments as far back through documented records as they'll go. And when that trail finally runs dry, the way it eventually does for almost everyone, that's your cue to let your own biology pick up where the paperwork left off. The records that were lost to fire, to flood, and to time no longer have the final word. Your own DNA does. And it has been waiting, patiently, generation after generation, for someone to finally ask it the right question.